The quarter-acre strip of ground behind the old feed store had been empty for as long as anyone in town could remember. Too small for real farming, too rocky for a decent garden. The kind of leftover parcel that existed on paper more than in anyone's actual plans. When Desmond Otieno bought it for almost nothing at a county tax sale, the clerk processing the paperwork asked him, not unkindly, what exactly he thought he was going to do with a piece of ground that small. He said he wasn't sure yet. That wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only one he gave anyone for months. If you believe small isn't the same thing as worthless, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Desmond was 34, new to the county. Having moved there the year before after a decade working agricultural extension jobs across 3 different states, the kind of work that taught him more about soil than most lifelong farmers ever bothered learning, because his job had always been diagnosing other people's failing ground rather than working his own. He'd never actually owned land until that quarter acre. And the town, small enough that everyone noticed everyone else's business, mostly assumed he'd bought it out of some sentimental attachment to finally having a piece of dirt with his name on the deed rather than any real plan. The ground itself explained why nobody else had wanted it. Thin topsoil over a shelf of compacted clay and rock that made a shovel ring rather than sink, the kind of ground that had defeated at least 2 previous owners who'd tried gardens there and given up within a season. Old Mrs. Halloran, who ran the feed store the parcel sat behind, told Desmond plainly the first week he was out there that her own father had called that strip cursed ground, and that nothing but weeds had grown there in the 60 years she'd watched it. Desmond didn't argue with her. He just started digging test holes, the way his old extension job had trained him to, checking depth, drainage, and composition at a dozen points across the quarter acre before he'd committed to planting anything at all. What he found wasn't good news exactly, but it wasn't the dead ground everyone assumed either. The clay shelf sat deep enough in most spots that raised beds with proper soil brought in could root well above it, and the site's south-facing slope and full sun exposure, largely wasted on ground nobody had ever taken seriously, were actually better growing conditions than most of the flatter, shadier plots around town. There was one person in the county who understood soil rehabilitation better than Desmond's own training had covered, an old organic grower named Patrice Whitfield, who'd spent 30 years slowly rebuilding worn-out ground on her own small farm outside town, using nothing but compost, cover crops, and patience most modern operations didn't have time for. Desmond drove out to see her with soil samples and a question. Could ground this compacted actually be brought back inside a single growing season? Or was he wasting his time expecting fast results? Patrice looked at his samples a long time before answering. Depends what you're willing to give it first, she said. Most people want the ground to feed them before they've fed the ground anything at all. That backwards thinking is why places like this stay cursed for 60 years instead of 6. That conversation shaped everything that followed. Patrice walked him through building raised beds, deep enough to sit above the clay shelf entirely, filled with a careful compost blend rather than fighting the existing soil directly, and taught him to plant a fast cover crop first, tilling it under before it even flowered, purely to start feeding biological life back into ground that had been essentially sterile compacted clay and rock for decades. Desmond's first attempt at direct planting without following that sequence nearly proved Mrs. Halloran right. He'd gotten impatient in early spring and tried a small test row of greens directly into the native soil alongside his prepared beds, mostly out of curiosity about whether Patrice's more careful approach was really necessary. The direct planted row barely germinated, seedlings that emerged sitting stunted and yellow within 2 weeks. Exactly the kind of failure that had discouraged every previous owner of that ground. Patrice, when he told her, wasn't surprised. That's the ground teaching you the same lesson it taught everyone else, she said. The raised beds are the only reason anything else out there is going to work at all. He committed fully to her method after that, building out the full quarter acre in raised beds through the spring, filling them with compost he sourced partly from Mrs. Halloran's own feed store waste, Spoiled grain and bedding material she'd been paying to have hauled away for years, and was glad to give him for free once she understood what he wanted it for. Word moved through town slowly, mostly as continued mild amusement. A few of the older men who gathered at the feed store counter each morning took to calling it Desmond's dirt boxes, a phrase that stuck for most of that first season. Desmond didn't push back on the joke. He just kept working, checking soil moisture, thinning seedlings, and rotating crops through raised beds that, by early summer, had started producing something nobody expected from ground. Everyone had written off decades earlier. His first real harvest came in July. A modest but genuinely productive crop of tomatoes, peppers, and greens that Desmond began selling directly from a small table outside the feed store on Saturday mornings, with Mrs. Halloran's blessing and, increasingly, her open curiosity. The quality surprised people before the quantity did. The tomatoes grown in soil built specifically to that ground's south-facing sun exposure ripened earlier and tasted noticeably better than what most backyard gardens in town were producing on flatter, less sunny ground. By August, Desmond's Saturday table had a small but genuine line most weeks, and the same men who'd joked about dirt boxes started stopping by to actually buy tomatoes, several of them asking, with a little less mockery each time, how exactly he'd managed to grow anything on that particular strip of ground at all. The turning point for the whole town's perception came during an unusually dry stretch in late August that stressed most local gardens badly. Shallow-rooted plants in ordinary native soil, wilting under heat that Desmond's deep-raised beds, with their better drainage and compost-rich structure, handled without much trouble at all. While several neighbors watched their own gardens struggle, Desmond's quarter-acre kept producing steadily straight through the weeks of the year. A contrast plain enough that people stopped needing it explained to them. Mrs. Halloran, watching the whole season unfold from her store window, eventually admitted to Desmond that her father's cursed ground comment had apparently been more about impatience than truth. 60 years of nobody willing to actually rebuild what generations of neglect and thin topsoil had worn down. She started keeping a standing order from his table every week, and mentioned to enough customers that word reached a small restaurant 2 towns over, whose owner drove out, personally, to see the quarter-acre everyone had started talking about. By the following spring, Desmond had a standing supply arrangement with that restaurant, expanded his raised beds to cover the full parcel more intensively, and had begun fielding questions from several neighbors, curious whether he'd help them attempt something similar on their own difficult ground. Patrice, when Desmond told her how the season had gone, said simply that she wasn't surprised. That ground people call worthless is usually just ground. Nobody's been patient enough to actually listen to yet. The town didn't change overnight. But something in the way people looked at that quarter-acre did. What had been an empty, mocked strip of ground behind the feed store for 60 years became, within a single season, proof that most of what gets written off as worthless just needed someone willing to ask what it actually needed instead of assuming they already knew. Desmond still works that same quarter-acre today, the raised beds a little deeper and richer each season, Mrs. Halloran's feed store waste still feeding his compost the way it did that first uncertain spring. And every summer, when the tomatoes come in early and the Saturday line forms outside the feed store, a few more people remember exactly why they used to call it cursed ground, and exactly why they don't anymore. If you've ever had something small get written off before anyone gave it a real chance, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else gave up on.